Hello, and welcome to the Soul Elevation Podcast, guiding your ascension to new heights. I'm your host, Kara Goodwin, and today I want to reflect upon some experiences that I had right before I had my spiritual awakening. And it's funny because it's something that I haven't necessarily, because it happened before I had my spiritual awakening. It was in hindsight, and it was a considerable amount of time before I made the connection of what had happened to me and that it was right before I had my spiritual awakening. And that those two things that they went together, right? Because when we are still working in a linear mind, rational experience of how reality works, then sometimes we don't necessarily think like, oh, this happened a few months before this happened, so they're not related. And then once we understand more about the multidimensional aspects of reality, we can see things a lot differently. So, what happened with me was this awakening of the third eye. Now, the third eye is the also like an anatomical aspect of the third eye is the pineal gland, which is in the center of the brain. But it's this center kind of, if you could just put your finger like right through, like if your finger could keep going, it would go back there. But it tends to be represented in like if you're trying to see where it might be, you've probably seen illustrations, like ancient illustrations from India, for example, where they have an eye kind of up in between the two, your physical eyes. So up on the forehead in the middle, there's another eye. So this is the third eye. So that is associated with psychic sight and the seat of your consciousness, the seat of your soul. And this is dormant before your spiritual awakening. Not, I guess not completely dormant all the time, maybe. There is a lot of calcification that happens through modern living with pollution and diet and fluoride and things like that. That does calcify the pineal gland. But anyway, so back to my experience. I was living in Italy. I'd been living there for several years with my family. And one day we were driving up to the mountains. And so this must have been about February. And I used to get these things called ocular migraines, and I'd had them for probably 15 years up to that point. And I would get them rarely, but an ocular migraine is when you actually are seeing um, distortions in your visual field. And then that may or may not be accompanied by a really strong headache or a migraine. So I would have these, and I would always get the visual aspect and the pain. Usually, I would get pain, but it was kind of like I would start seeing these obstructions in my vision, and I would kind of know, like, oh, my head's gonna be really, really hurting in a few hours. So usually, the pain and the visual distortion went hand in hand, and it would last. It would go in and out throughout one day. And so we were driving up to the mountains, and I started seeing this obstruction in my visual field, like in the peripheral. So it wasn't like if I'm looking straight at something, it wasn't directly in my line of vision. I could never directly look at it. Like anywhere, if I started to look over here, it would move. It was always in my peripheral. And it was this black and white checkerboard circle, and it was rotating. And I was like, oh, I'm getting a migraine. And I kept waiting for the headache to come, and no headache came, but that visual stayed, and it was still there the next day, and the next day, and the next day. I had this obstruction in my vision for 3 to 4 months, and I got my eyes checked. I actually ended up going to the hospital. Because I had a friend in Italy who was an optometrist, and her husband also was an optometrist. And I described what I was seeing, and that I was never getting any headaches. And she said, I was an avid runner at the time, and she was like, okay, I want you to stop running immediately. Don't run anymore. I'm booking an appointment for you at the hospital as soon as they can get you in, but do not run. She thought I had that my macula was detaching. I think that's right. She was worried about macular degeneration based on what I was describing. And she's like, if you run, then that kind of could make it detach completely. Um, and so I went to the hospital, and they did all these checks, and they could see there was something that they could see kind of behind my eye, if I remember correctly. And but it was the diagnosis, quote unquote, was like that I'd had this virus, and it was like this really rare. I mean, they had they printed off this information, and he was trying to convince me that, like, my kids must have had this virus, and I must have had these symptoms sometime in the past, few months. And I was like, I wasn't sick. I didn't have any of those symptoms. My kids didn't have those symptoms. But in the pool of people that had been part of this study for whatever, I can't even remember now what the diagnosis was, but it was like 8 people or something. I mean, it was such a small study that I didn't really fit what they were saying. When I went to America later that summer, I was still having it a little bit, but it was starting to go away. And the doctor was like, your eyes are so healthy. There's not a trace of anything there. So it must have cleared up. And I can't remember, gosh, it's been many years now. It's been like 9 years. But I think it was still like fading in and out. Like I could still see it sometimes, but there was like, she couldn't pick up on anything. When I was in Italy, I do remember that they said that there was something that they could see anatomically in there. But this was a really mysterious thing. Again, like what they told me in Italy, what like didn't match what I had experienced. It was kind of like they were trying to figure it out. And then they did see something, but then when I went to the eye doctor like a month later in America, like they didn't see that. So I don't really know anatomically what was going on with that. But now that I know more about the pineal gland, or I know anything about the pineal gland, I didn't know anything about that at the time. And I hadn't undergone any sort of spiritual awakening. But this happened in 2016, and it happened in the spring, well, the winter and spring of 2016. Now, by May of 2016, that is when my life turned upside down. That was when it started with my sister-in-law taking her life. And it just in chronological order, like my sister-in-law taking her life was like shocking and devastating, and was just like my life felt like it just turned 90 degrees. And I was like, I don't even recognize what is going on. Um, 3 weeks later, our dog died. And then a few weeks after that, my stepdad was having surgery on his brainstem. My mother-in-law got hit by a motorbike when she was crossing the street, so she was hospitalized for a long time. And then by November of that year, my stepmom had been in the ICU with a failing heart starting in, I want to say September. I think it was September. And then she had a heart transplant by Thanksgiving, which is in November. So it was a like monster year. And because of all of that, I learned meditation because I needed something. Like I just didn't recognize my life anymore. I was in this constant like state of alert and anxiety. And so I found meditation really like as a coping mechanism, but it was through meditation that I had this spiritual awakening. And it was, I mean, I guess in some ways it was slow, and in some ways it was fast, but it's still ongoing. I don't know that we ever like fully as a human fully awaken to where we like really know everything. And we're like completely enlightened just because of the nature of the brain and like how vast this universe is, how multidimensional, multi-universal. Um, there's just so much information. It's hard for me to imagine that a human brain could actually hold all of it. I think that we can reach enlightenment, but I don't know that the human brain is capable of understanding everything. So that's why I think it's just you can be quote unquote enlightened by human standards, but I think that you will never, as a human, really fully understand everything at the God level. But anyway, so it was years later after that had happened that I even remembered that I had gone through that with my eyes. I remember that by the time I got to the hospital for that exam, and when I'd actually finally started taking action, because I was like, God, I just kept expecting that these visuals would go away, and they just never did. And finally, I was like, I guess I should have myself checked out, because I was actually like, is this a brain tumor? Because I didn't know how to account for it. I knew that other people weren't seeing what I was seeing. I didn't have any information on what it was that I was seeing. And I I remember, like, my sister-in-law passed away. My husband went to England to be with his family, and me and my kids were going to come like a couple of days later. And I couldn't go with him right away because I had this hospital appointment. And I remember going to this hospital appointment, and I was so worried that they were going to find a tumor. And then I was going to have to like tell my husband, who just lost his sister, that I now had a brain tumor. And then I was so relieved when, I mean, of course I was relieved when I didn't have a brain tumor, but, I mean, that's how long this had gone on. That's how confusing it was for me, how I had no frame of reference. Um, so now in hindsight, when I look at that and I look at the timing is so specific, or is so important for me when I look back on this, because now I can look at it from a more removed perspective, and I can see what was just up ahead for me. And I really do think that I was moving into, I don't know if it depends what your frame of reference is. Like, you could think of it as I was moving into a different timeline. I was moving into a really important phase of my life. And I think that my pineal gland was starting to activate, and that I was literally visually seeing representations of that awakening and that opening of the third eye in my visual field. And it's a process. These things don't necessarily happen like that. They can take time. And the pineal gland is very much connected to our visual field, our visual cortex. That's why, and it actually, interestingly enough, the pineal gland has cellular rods and cones in the same way that the physical eyes do. So it doesn't actually have the propensity to see specifically the same way as the physical eyes. It's not a physical eye, but it does share some cellular anatomy, if you want to think of it that way, that the physical eyes do, which is fascinating. That there's this representation of visual perception at the cellular level in the pineal gland. So I wanted to share this today just because I remember how I was kind of worried when I was seeing this and going through it. And it's not something that I hear other people talking about. I don't um, I don't know of anybody else who has described that, happening over a period of months, that they were seeing something like that. But I do suspect that I'm not alone, that I'm not the only person who experienced it that way, or who would experience that way. So if you or somebody that you know is having some sort of symptom like this, I I hope that this is helping to frame what could be happening. Now, of course, I would recommend that you do seek medical advice just to make sure that there's not something physically happening, not and that it's not serious. Um, so, we want to like cover all our bases here and not just assume that, oh, I'm seeing these things in my visual field. It's a spiritual awakening. It's part of my awakening. It could be. It could be something physical. It could be both. You could have a some sort of psychic or spiritual awakening that is also having a physical, there might be a physical representation. Everything is connected. Our body is not, our physical body, our anatomy is not separate from the energy that we are. It's not separate from our spirit. It's an expression of our spirit. So it very well could be that you have some sort of visual thing. In fact, when I started getting migraines, I was just thinking about this yesterday. I started getting migraines in my early 20s, and I went to an eye doctor because I didn't know what it was. And as I'm describing what it is, he's just nodding and nodding, and I'm thinking, okay, he knows for sure what this is. And he told me it's an ocular migraine. It's a visual migraine. And he knew what it was. And so I had this physical explanation for what it was. I wonder in hindsight if there was a third eye, something to do, like the third eye was starting to vibrate or something. I mean, that was way before any sort of spiritual awakening for me. But, again, we can just have these little physical things that can happen that are preparing our body or are part of this process so we can do. Sometimes we need to do like a little bit at a little bit by a little bit, instead of like, bam, you're literally dealing with frequency when you are, when we're dealing with energy, you're dealing with frequency, and your body, even though it's solid, it is vibrating, and it's vibrating at a specific frequency. So there is a process of raising your frequency so that you can be able to handle higher and higher frequencies. And that can be a subtle and slow process so that you can kind of build that up. So that could be what was happening as well. So I hope that this can be helpful for you. If you or anybody that you know is undergoing something like this, if you do have experience with this, please do comment. I would love to hear, or maybe you've had different experiences physically, that you'd like to share. I find it fascinating. I'd love to hear. So thank you so much for watching. I wish you many, many blessings.